I'm going to teach this morning on listening to the wrong voice. We've been teaching about how to hear from the Lord, but it's kind of like this. We live in this fallen world filled with darkness, and it's not physical darkness, it's spiritual darkness. If you were actually allowed to ascend through the heavens, the first heaven is the one you can see, the sky. Second heaven is where the sun and the moon and stars are. And third heaven is where those who've departed in the Lord live. If you could go there, if Jesus would take you there, you'd go through darkness and you'd be astounded that they're physical beings and they're constantly speaking. And it's kind of like elevator music that's playing in the background of an elevator or a restaurant where you're hearing it, but you're not really thinking about it. You're hearing it, but you're not fully aware of it. Well, there's background voices that are speaking to you all the time. And they're saying things like, you can't make it, you're no good, God doesn't love you, you might better give up, you might better quit. It's a constant drone of discouragement. And it's an interesting thing. What God planned was that we would get among each other and we'd hear encouraging things. Or we'd go to a meeting and we'd hear truth preached, worship that gets our eyes off here and scatters the darkness and gets us focused on the Father, and He comes down through that, and you get encouragement and nutrition, and then you hear prophetic words, and you go out of there feeling really good because for a moment there's been a swath of light that has cut through the darkness and you feel better. And for most people, they can get it to about Wednesday, from Sunday to Wednesday, and they need that again. And I pity the poor people who are not in any kind of real fellowship, because I don't know what they're hearing, but it can't be good. And we need each other. This whole COVID thing, trying to shut down our churches, well, it's actually unhealthy. It makes you more susceptible to COVID because you're discouraged, you're down, you're alone, you're isolated, you're locked down. It is not a good thing, and a lot of churches have been really challenged. A lot of them aren't back together fully yet. Some of them, it really showed cracks that were there before, but it really made them wider. And but we found out that we really need each other. There's something about even just going into the meeting house where other people are, all of a sudden you feel an energy. Well, that's not from people, that's from God in people. And then we hear something in the worship, we hear something in a prayer, we hear something in an exhortation, we hear something prophetic that just makes us feel entirely different. We get a different perspective, a different way of seeing, and that stops that negativity. And there are many voices. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said, there are many voices in the world, and there really are. There's lots of voices vying for your attention, vying for your affection, wanting you to surrender your will. There's lots of voices, and you're hearing them, whether you're aware that you're hearing them or not. You can tell what you're listening to. It's kind of like a radio. Like if we put a big radio, I remember when I was a kid, I had a radio about this tall, and I would get up late at night, often in the middle of the night, and I was just a kid, and I would start turning the knob to see what I could find. And every now and again, I'd hit New York City or Louisiana or Russia. I'd hear some Russian on there. It's all there. All those frequencies, all those radio signals were going through my house, but I needed to get on, I needed a receiver that could pick that up. And once I got the receiver set, I could pick up the signal. And there's something true. I think God's speaking. I think angels are speaking. But you can tell where people's dial is set by what comes out of their mouth. You can tell if their dial is set to negativity and condemnation because what they're hearing will come out of their mouth. What you're hearing will come out of your mouth. I can just tell in a matter of seconds where people's dials are turned, that they're listening to the wrong voice, they're listening to darkness, or they're listening to the Spirit of the Lord. Because what we found out when COVID first hit, there are people who were saying the mind of the Lord, and it made sense, and it made you feel stable, it made you feel like you could make it, made you feel that this thing is not so big and so bad as they're making it out to be. But the people who are dialed into CNN, we called it a CNN worldview, they were so negative, so pessimistic. They would show up at the subway down in New York City completely clothed in plastic with a big bubble on their head because they're listening to the wrong voice, and they're paranoid and they're paralyzed by COVID. So it just depends on what you're listening to, the frequency you're listening to. It's either going to be negative or positive. It's going to affect you, and it's going to come out of your mouth. There was a king one time who was thinking about his kingdom, and he got thinking, he was wondering, how many flowers are in my kingdom? So he called in a census taker, and the guy came in with a clipboard, said, "Yes, sir." And he says, "I want you to go and count all the flowers in my kingdom." So he said, "Okay, yes, sir." And off he marched. The king got thinking about it. He thought, well, if I know how many flowers I have in my kingdom, what good is that unless I can compare it with how many weeds I have in my kingdom? So he called in another census taker. And he says, "Go count all the weeds in my kingdom." So he said, "Yes, sir," and he marched off. A little while later, the second census taker came stomping back in, threw down the clipboard, and said, "I'm out of here. This kingdom is just overrun with weeds. I didn't even get past the drawbridge, and I can't count all the weeds in this kingdom. There's so many. This place is overrun with weeds. This is a lousy kingdom. I want out." The first census taker came floating in, and he said, "Oh, king, I never want to leave this kingdom. This is the most beautiful kingdom on earth. I've just spent the day looking in the face of flowers, one flower after. This kingdom is so beautiful. I never want to leave this kingdom." And the moral of the story is, you'll see what you're looking for, and it will affect you. You could almost say you'll hear what you're listening for, and it'll also affect you. It reminds me of a guy that was sitting on the wall of a city, and this ox cart was going down the road, and it was loaded with furniture, and the kids were piled on top. And the man driving the ox cart hollered to this old timer sitting on the stone wall. He said, "Hey, old timer, what are the people like in this city?" Pointing to the city behind him, behind the wall. He said, what were the people like in the city where you came from?" He said, "Oh, they're the worst people. Thieves, liars, hypocrites. The worst people you can imagine. That's why we're moving." He said, "That's what the people are like in this city." So he kept moving. A little while later, another ox cart comes down with all the furniture, and someone's moving, and they got all the kids and the animals, and they're moving along, and they see the man sitting on the wall. They say, "Hey, old timer, what are the people like in this city?" What were the people like in the city where you came from?" He said, "They were the best people. Salt of the earth, good, honest people." He said, "That's what the people are like in this city." Isn't that interesting? How we see and how we think of people, that gets projected and transferred onto other people and our life circumstance. People say life is bad, America's terrible. Well, someone else thinks it's great. A lot of people trying to get here, a lot of people trying to get in here. There must be something good about it. But it's a matter of our mental disposition. And you can decide that. But you can also tune your ear. Worship is profound in moving the dial of your receptivity to your receiver to be able to hear the melodies of heaven. If you could all just poke your head in heaven for 5 minutes right now, somehow you could get past all the darkness, poke your head into heaven. One of the things that would shock you is how positive it is, how bright and how happy, how joy-filled. People are worshiping, people are speaking kindly to each other. You'd be amazed at how happy, joyful it is. Come back down through the darkness and you hear people grumbling and complaining, and valleys are low and mountains are high. What God wants to do is take the bounce out of our life. He doesn't want us to have the high highs or the low lows. He wants us to be able to go through life unaffected by how you feel or what's on the news or what's happening on the border of Russia and Ukraine, and what kind of the new variant that's coming. It's funny listening to the news or watching the news. They're already projecting a new variant that's a worse strain than before. I mean, it's just always pushing people's buttons. But it's possible to live independent of all of that. I thought I would teach this morning on listening to the wrong voice in contrast to listening to the voice of the Lord. Let's start with the voice of the Lord and see if we can learn a few things about His voice that are always assured, that are always true, that will always happen. Do you want to listen? Do you want to listen in to what the Lord is saying? Okay.